Hi, and welcome to Arden University's Brain Awareness Week podcast. The following episode is part of the student-led series on stress, how to manage it, and how it impacts our brain. Welcome to this episode. Our guest today is Sharon Buckland. Sharon comes from a background rooted in service delivery of third sector brain injury rehabilitation. Sharon spent many years developing training programs for health professionals to better support patients recovering from brain injury. Sharon also completed her doctorate at the beginning of 2020, for which she studied coping styles, family changes, and loss on the ability to adjust to acquired brain injury. Sharon, welcome. Thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
I would also like to invite Bettina for a short introduction. She is the co-host of our episode, and I'm very glad that she will be with us today. Bettina, welcome.
Hi, everyone. My name is Bettina, and I'm a psychology student at Arden, soon to be undergraduate, actually, and I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
So in today's episode, we'll discuss the basics of how stress is processed by the brain, how it impacts the brain, and we'll also speak a bit of what happens in the brain when we experience stress, what happens in the brain when we try to cope with stress, to then move on to Sharon's PhD research and talk about this in a little bit more detail. Shall we just start off, Sharon?
Absolutely, yeah.
So could you tell us a bit about the basics of stress processing in the brain, as in what is happening in our brain when we experience stress?
Well, stress in itself is quite an elusive term, so it might be helpful to first consider what we mean by this. Generally, a stimulus which elicits a stress response is considered a stressor, and the physiological reaction to that stressor is called the stress response. So there are many factors which influence this basic interaction, such as our subjective appraisal, our health status at the time, and the environment we're in, and so on. So stress is a very complicated process that we will try to simplify for the processes here. Walter Cannon was actually first attributed to linking this term to human psychology. It came from engineering. And Hans Selye took this idea and really ran with it, looking into stress as a physiological response, and the bit that we're really interested in. Selye's early conceptualization was called the general adaptation syndrome model, whereby stress refers to the changes within our nervous system which attempt to maintain homeostasis. So short-term stress responses can be thought as adaptive under this model. But if they're severe or enduring, then they start to become harmful. So homeostasis and allostasis are really the backbones of our stress responses. The term homeostasis is used to describe the balance between the physiological systems within our bodies that give us healthy functioning. Stress can occur when we detect a threat to this internal imbalance. Allostasis is kind of the mechanism by which we aim to get this balance back. So basically, what is happening when we feel stressed is we've detected a real or potential threat to our homeostasis. This activates two systems, the HPA axis and the SAM axis. The HPA axis is mainly responsible for our secretion of cortisol, and the SAM axis mainly secretes adrenaline. And together they help us prepare for the demands of the stressor and support regulation of our body back to its healthy balance.
Right. That's a lot of information. Could we maybe, for the people who maybe don't study psychology or don't know so much about biology, could we maybe think of some simple analogies or simplifications of homeostasis and allostasis to clarify that perhaps a little bit?
I just normally think of it that our body likes to be balanced and stable, and that keeps, we're functioning at our optimum level. Then it's what our bodies are made for, and they're not made for these demands that we put it under on a day-to-day basis. So that's where we see issues with stress, is that we're constantly trying to keep this biological rhythm going within us, and we're constantly knocking it off kilter, if you like, with the demands that we put our bodies under. So it's stress is really this want of the body to be stable and calm, and the processes we put it under to try and maintain that.
Right. And then this process of allostasis, could we also try and describe this in a bit more simple terms and examples, so for people who have not that background couldn't follow up with that?
I guess to simplify it, it's really, to me, it feels very evolutionary, like we are built to maybe respond to stresses such as threats from predators. We've got these environmental stresses that our bodies are designed to respond to. And as we've kind of evolved this very complex society we now live in, we've got all these psychological demands that we put ourselves under. And the allostasis, and we'll talk a bit later about allostatic load, is where we're secreting all of these hormones and neurotransmitters to try and balance out this physiological balance that we're aiming for. And because we are doing this too often, then we become in very negative forms of stress on the body.
Right. That's really nice. Thank you for sharing that with us. Could we maybe also look a bit, because later on you said something about the HPA axis and the SAM axis. Could we clarify this bit a little bit for our listeners?
They're sort of two systems within our autonomic nervous system which help us to get that balance back. So we're talking about the regulation of our nervous system here, really. So there are just these kind of pumps, if you like, that give us different ingredients in our body to act in certain ways. Maybe increase oxygen to our muscles so that we can act more quickly and more with more explosion, or increase our cognitive capacity in times of stress and when we're under threat. So that's really the basis of it, is our nervous system functioning.
It's so interesting, because often when we speak about stress, we get this like threat ID, fight or flight ID. But do you think that in modern times that we live in today, that there is like a less extreme version of stress that is still eliciting the same response, perhaps?
Sorry, I didn't quite get what you...
Well, I was saying like often like in these literatures, you see a lot of like very extreme examples of like threat and like fight or flight response. However, in modern times, we often feel under stress without these like very highly dangerous situations.
Okay. Yeah. I got you. So we don't often sort of go around the corner and see a tiger. That's the normal kind of fight or flight examples we see, aren't they? But what we can also feel stress from is just overload, so a build-up of stresses. So stress will either be caused by something severe or something enduring. So it doesn't have to be a big event. It can be what we would call a pile-up of stresses. So just lots of little things that aren't giving you the break that you need.
Right. And could you then perhaps tell us a little bit about the differences between chronic stress and acute stress in terms of how this impacts our brain?
Yeah, sure. So short and fleeting stress responses can actually be really good for us. They are shown to increase focus and productivity. You think about if you get nervous before public speaking, you're really focused, and it can really bring out the best in you. And it can also help you act quickly in a crisis and really respond as you need to. But if we endure severe or chronic stress, then we start to get allostatic overload. And this is when we start to see those health problems. Well-known complication of chronic stress is gastric ulcers. And I remember as a kid, my mum used to say to me, calm down or you're going to give yourself an ulcer. And I'd be like, well, how on earth does that work? But we're talking about psychosomatic conditions, the psychological basis, and creating a physical representation in the body. Other examples would be high blood pressure and coronary heart disease, and even impaired immune system functions. They're all physical manifestations from sort of that psychological basis of stress. But we can also see more cognitive and psychological changes due to that imbalance in the autonomic nervous system we've been talking about. So anxiety, heightened fear responses, because we're kind of always on. Our autonomic nervous system is too active. So if you're experiencing chronic stress, you're more likely to have quite a high level of anxiety with that. But it can also impact our cognition, shown to have an impact on memory, learning, and decision making can all be negatively affected if we are experiencing stress.
Right. Well, that's quite a long list of implications.
Yeah.
Because
we should care about it more than we do, I always think.
Yeah, well, it really seems like it. Again, for the non-psychology students, the non-biologically oriented people, could you maybe clarify what the autonomic nervous system is and how that is embedded in the body?
So our autonomic nervous system is the branch of our central nervous system, which it's termed the fight or flight system. So it will help us respond to stimulus that we need to act on. So the parasympathetic nervous system is going to be more about the rest and digest system. So it helps us to, our internal organs function and our digestive system. And then we've got this other system, the autonomic nervous system, which helps us to respond to the stimuli as we need to. So it will get our muscles growing, our blood pressure up and ready to either fight or flight or freeze or whatever we do when we're in a crisis.
Right. Thank you for that clarification. Like I said just before, like when we see all these effects of stress, it gets a bit negative. Like on a more optimistic note, there's maybe coping ways or strategies that also impact the brain in a more positive way.
Yeah. I mean, the good news is that there is a lot of evidence-based techniques out there that are being tested and under empirical conditions to see if they can help us with our stress responses. So ultimately, we're aiming to reduce that autonomic nervous system activity and decrease levels of stress hormone in our brain. So things like progressive muscle relaxation and breathing techniques and mindfulness in particular are all showing evidence that they create more stable autonomic nervous system regulation, which in turn lowers our blood pressure and decreases the chance of cardiac problems.
Right. So doing all these things is actually really important.
Really important. They have, just as the negative sides have a physical response in our body, so do the positive sides. So helping to regulate that nervous system activity really brings positive health benefits and can counteract the negative health benefits. And it's not that, we're starting to see there's actual evidence that this happens. It's not just sort of, take a deep breath and you'll be fine sort of thing. That sort of regulating your nervous system activity is really important.
And you think that these effects also persist over longer time periods?
Sorry?
Do you think these effects also persist over long term?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm not an expert in this part at all, but I would say that it's a work in progress. So with techniques, it's not that you do one mindfulness session and that's fine. You need to practice them. You need to continue them and make them just as much a part of life as whatever it is that's creating the stress for you in the first place.
Right. Bettina, would you like to move on to some other interview questions?
Yes. So Sharon, what I would like to know is how does our own brain interact with our own ability to cope with stress?
Okay, so that's a really complicated question, and there definitely isn't a straightforward answer. But the challenges with stress research really come from how complex it is, the entanglement of physical, psychological, behavioural and societal factors. So when we try and conduct research, we try to filter out these variables and anything that's going to be confounding on our results and try and look for that true cause and effect. But understanding what effects relate to the physiological stress response, or which are the poor health behaviours that might increase under stress, such as smoking and drinking, what's down to different personalities or the appraisal of the stress, it just creates a melting pot of variables. I know from my work with brain injury individuals, we would try to do a lot of unpicking of those factors. So if they're experiencing stress or coping issues, what is it down to? Are they struggling to cope because there's a deficit in the executive functioning, so they can no longer problem solve their stress? Or is it something down to the mental health and they need help to come to terms with what's happened to them before they can start to try to solve day-to-day stresses? Or it could even be down to if a social group has been lost and the relationships in the family are strained, and that's a coping strategy that's now no longer available. But quite often what we'd see is that it can be a bit of everything.
Yeah, individually very, very varying. Yeah, I see. So what would you say happens to our brain when we are experiencing a stress response? Should we be worried when under a lot of stress?
I know it sounds quite terrifying when you really start to think about it, and the health implications that can come from chronic or severe stress. But a bit of stress is nothing to be afraid of, and it can actually make us more resilient human beings. So stress is a good part of life. We don't want to be without stress. But of course, we're interested in the downsides here because we want to avoid these negative consequences. So prolonged states of allostasis are what we're worried about. And they're what we can see change our brain structures. We can see these effects take place. And this comes really from the increased exposure to cortisol in particular and the stress hormones in our brain. We've been seen to reduce certain structures in our brain. So hippocampal volume in particular has been seen to reduce after times of very long exposure to increased cortisol. So we can go on to then experience cognitive challenges from this, such as poor memory and impaired decision making. And sometimes that's just due as well to this, the different parts of the brain becoming overactive and others taking a back seat just to try to deal with the stress response that's continually taking place.
Yeah, so kind of the brain is trying to make up for it in a certain way to focus the attention somewhere else, putting it to like an explanation. All right.
And I think we can all sort of relate to when we feel stressed, very overwhelmed, we don't often make the right decisions. We can maybe don't perform our best. So, there's that sort of curve. I can't remember the psychologist that did it, but there's a bit of stress is good and it goes up and you get really good, and then too much and your performance goes right down again. So it's watching out for those markers and trying to find that sweet spot is probably really good.
All right, so Sharon, you did a PhD research, as Mara mentioned before. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. Anyone that's done a PhD, it's their favourite question. After all that work, you want to talk about it with someone. But basically, I was looking at change and how people adjust to life changes. And my context was with the acquired brain injury community. And so I looked at 3 key areas of impact. I looked at coping ability, changes to family structures, and functioning and loss. It started out as a mixed methods investigation. So I collected a ton of quantitative data and did some interviews as well. But after analysing all these statistics, I decided to change my whole thesis to qualitative and focus on the experiences, which was a massive move because I was only 3 months from handing at that point. But luckily it paid off and I pulled it out the bag somehow. And I actually ended up creating a chapter that looked at the discrepancies between quantitative and qualitative data when looking at psychosocial constructs such as stress and coping. And so at least it wasn't all wasted in the end.
Oh, for sure. It must be very interesting. Is it available for public, or is there any way our audience maybe can gain a look at it, or it's not?
I think all theses go into the public domain, from what I was led to believe. I don't know how, I'll have to look it up, but I think they are widely available theses.
Yeah, it would be great, for everybody who would like to look at it. It must be very interesting to read.
Thank you.
But I think it's, maybe for those who are not really familiar with the basics, even in the stress, so on the psychological side, it might be a bit of a difficult read. But
I don't know, because it's very it's about people's experiences of it. So there's a lot of humanity in there. It's not numbers and figures and F values and P values. It's people talking about what it feels like. So in some ways, it's probably really accessible. Just lots of words.
All right. So could you also tell us about how brain injuries relate to one's ability to cope with stress?
Yeah, sure. So one of the key findings from my research was the ability or loss of ability to access pre-existing coping strategies. And I looked at how this impacted on someone's ability to cope with their life after they'd had their injury. So as we all tend to have a go-to way of coping, whether we consciously think about it or not. If something occurs then that stops us being able to access a go-to strategy, we can experience a loss of confidence and an increase in anxiety. And that was something that really came through from my research, was people thinking that they didn't feel they could trust themselves to deal with stress any longer because they'd lost those strategies. And sometimes that was due to an impact in executive functioning skills, and sometimes it was a loss of emotional control. In addition, I investigated whether the goodness of fit hypothesis was helpful for those with ABI. So the goodness of fit hypothesis was developed by eminent stress researchers Lazarus and Folkman. And that proposes that maximum success, the type of coping strategy, should match the stressor. For example, something that's controllable should be paired with a problem-solving strategy, and something that is uncontrollable should work on the emotion that's associated with that and try to eliminate it. So there's some debate whether acquired brain injury is a problem-based or emotion-based stressor. It's highly likely it results in both, because the ABI itself is not solvable, no matter how good you are at coping. But some of the challenges faced afterwards can be supported and worked through like problems. So new strategies can be put in place to help somebody. And if the person with ABI can get the matches of emotion and problem-focused techniques right, then there's a greater chance of positive psychosocial outcomes for that person. But it's the role of them and their family and the health professionals that are supporting them to try and help them match these coping styles, so that they can cope with the newfound demands of their post-injury life.
I see. Might also takes a lot of time for a person, just develop these kind of coping strategies and abilities, probably depending on the injury, of course. I mean, I'm not planning to go into this, but it is absolutely very, very interesting.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing it with us. Meryl, right back at you.
Yeah, I mean, what would be like what you enjoyed most about your research?
Oh gosh, well, it was just the generosity of the participants was just astounding. The people that I interviewed just bared their soul and really for the good of other people to learn from it, and a common, I'd say to be thankful to people, and they would be thanking me, saying it's just so good to have the opportunity to share what they've been through and kind of make use of it, really. It's something they can now do with that experience that they've been through that's been really traumatic or painful, and it has so much loss in it. This is, these kinds of projects are really collaborative. We see ourselves as researchers and we're the experts and we write it up and that, but it's a partnership. We work together on these with the people that are involved with us. It's a pleasure and it's really humbling.
Wow, it really sounds like a very long and valuable journey.
Thank you. Yeah, there's still a long way to go with it, but yeah, it was good. I enjoyed it.
Of course. Well, actually, I think this is a very lovely note to end this episode on. Thank you, Sharon, so much for everything that you shared with us today. Also, thanks to Bettina for being here with us. And of course, thanks to you, the listeners, for tuning in with us today. If you liked this episode and you are interested in more stress-related content, check out our other 2 episodes from this series during Brain Awareness Week. In the next episode, we'll talk about mindfulness as a stress management technique and its relation to the brain. Thanks again for listening, and we wish you an inspiring Brain Awareness Week.